So the Ctrl tilde is one of my favorite hotkeys of hardops, and in the first area, which is the workflow area of the tool, it actually controls most of the workflow options that you would expect. For example, let's expand just general options, and you can see that in here you can choose between smooth and flat, similar to other areas I showed earlier, but you can also toggle auto smooth and have auto smooth be on or off by just clicking on this. You can also choose whether or not to hard lock your normals or remove hard lock normals. For example, if you're importing from another program such as Moi, you may want to remove that. You can also come into this small area and choose to show your wires or show all wires for basically if you're using something like subdivision and optimal display is on, you could also make it show all wires. Right here, there's an area where you can choose the voxelization size and also choose to voxelize your object. So if we click on this, we see that it displays a notification after voxelization letting you know at what resolution it voxelized it. And by tabbing into edit mode, we can just see what was done to this cube. So back into the Ctrl tilde, this area is a smaller area that I rarely come to. However, when it comes to workflow, this is something that I do come to quite often. The majority of the time, I'm working inside of destructive and angle. Even if I'm actually working with a destructive workflow, I will still maintain a non-destructive workflow and then just apply things as I go. Angle refers to the current workflow that we are using inside of 2.8, with wait being a previous workflow that we used to use back in the 2.7 days, but is still employed for more complex shapes that require specific bevel control. In fact, both of these refer to a type of workflow involving the bevel modifier. The bevel modifier is capable of working at angle, which will let you stack them up theoretically on top. You can take a 30-degree bevel and start out with that, then place a 60-degree bevel on top of that, then place another 60-degree bevel on top of that if there's not geometry underneath to cause issues, while weight will allow you to mark areas as you want them marked, and then you can adjust B weight to basically mark them to be beveled less than they normally would be. So some areas can have a factor of 1, which is the full weight of the bevel modifier, while you can have other areas with lower bevel weights like 0.1 that will give you a lower weight to it. So finally, there's hardened normals and weighted normals. And these two actually pertain to some previous workflows that aren't completely utilized. Hardened normals is a setting on the bevel modifier that will allow you to harden the normals and will assist you with fixing shading. And so in the event that you're adding a bevel with hardops, we can actually choose to enable hardened normals off the bat. However, most of the time we leave that to the user to set manually. When it comes to weighted normals, it's also the same thing. Due to the speed performance hit that can come with weighted normal being present, sometimes it's actually better to add weighted normal at the end of the model or at a point when shading actually becomes an issue rather than having it on too early and choking yourself down with performance. So the next thing to discuss from here is the sort modifier system. I plan to go over this more in depth in the future, but whenever you perform an operation like a Boolean, we take special care to ensure that your modifiers are actually placed in a proper order. So just to demonstrate this in action, we'll give this a bevel, and then we will give this a second bevel, but we will press X and drop this at half the bevel width of this one. And so if we place our 3D cursor and we select both of these and perform a difference, we can see that this Boolean was actually placed before the last bevel, and this is something we refer to as last sorting. Last sorting is actually expandable via this area, and you can't actually turn on last sorting for items that aren't actually enabled in the sort area for obvious reasons. So hovering over each of these will give you a tooltip that explains more as to what they do, but for the most part, the defaults that we have in place are set to ensure that the user experience is as smooth as possible, but we will be going into it more in depth as we go on. Sharpening is the core of hardops, and through this area you can actually choose what your sharpening options do, whether you mark it as a crease, a seam, bevel weight, or sharp. There's various reasons why you would want to auto mark these type of things, or in my case actually mark all of them. Sometimes I mark all of them just to really clean shop and have a very linear modeling experience where I am in complete control over the creasing and the sharpening and the beveling, especially when working in a weight workflow. But below this, we also see another area that is also showing our ability to deal with smoothing and shading. For example, we could take this object and we'll jump back to flat. And if we were to go in here, and we'll also turn off auto smooth. So notice that if I click on any number, it toggles on auto smooth, but it also jumps that auto smooth parameter to that number. So sometimes whenever I'm modeling, I'll find that I need an auto smooth of say 30 to make it through a particular maneuver. But then I find later on that I need to jump the auto smooth up to 60. When it comes to hardops and using it to the fullest potential, it's all about getting the shading to be very optimal for whatever it is that you're working on. So one shape may require that you work at an auto smooth of say 60, but another shape could require you working at an auto smooth angle of something like 15 in order to get the shading to reflect correctly. And this really happens in situations with advanced angles. But of course, shading and bevels and Boolean is all a game of shading versus artifacts versus workflow. So I hope to go over and emphasize some of these things over the course of this video. So continuing on, the next thing is we want to talk about bool options. So whenever you perform booleans, there's a lot of things that can happen whenever you perform a boolean. For example, bevel step will basically step the bevel up a level whenever you perform a boolean operation and you hold control. So here we have a cube and we've already placed a bevel on it. And let's actually place a cube to bool into this. If we press Ctrl tilde, you can see that bool bevel step is on, which will basically not use sort bypass. So to show sort bypass in action, we'll turn off bool bevel step and we'll select this. And instead of choosing difference, we'll hover over it. And if we look at the control tip, we see that control will allow you to bypass. And we see that bypass did not place the bevel on top of the boolean like you would expect. Instead, we bypassed it, which allows us to come back later and just Control Shift click bevel to add a bevel of our own. However, I found this process to be slightly daunting to beginners. So for that reason, you can go in Control tilde and actually enable something called bool bevel step, which should be on by default. And if you were to Control click, you can see that it actually does the bevel and sets you up with the Boolean operation, basically combining them into one, allowing you to step up your model very quickly. So we'll duplicate this cube with Shift D, and we'll go here, press Q and Control click, and now we're B-stepping with the best of them. And it's really that easy in order to stack up Booleans and bevels on a model. And so here we are, we're now stacking several levels deep. So one of the things I like about hardops is its ability to collapse multiple modifier panels. If I wanted to do it here, I would just click on these little arrows, but I could press Ctrl tilde, go on my modifier panel, and actually just click this little arrow at the top for collapse modifiers. And I can actually show you that we're using bevel, Boolean, bevel, Boolean, bevel, Boolean, bevel, and we can just keep going exponentially until the end. When it comes to hardops, we care about you getting all the way to your destination, and also providing you with the tools to be able to be in control of that. So even at this moment, because they're modifiers, everything is still live and I can move things around. But you see that because these are levels that are built off of other levels working out, that moving such things haphazardly can cause issues. So continuing on our Shift tilde tour, the next one I want to talk about is bool sharpen parent shapes. So basically by checking this, this means that whenever you perform a Boolean, the shapes will be parented to the target object. So right now, if we move this object around, we can see that these objects did not come with it. And we can move it again just to double show you that. So just to confirm that that's an issue. We actually have an option in hardops called late parent that will allow you to fix these things retroactively if you happen to have made a mistake. But let's say that we wanted to actually prevent this from being an issue going forward. We have this shape selected, we select this shape, and in our Control tilde, we have bool sharpen parent bool shape. So this means that if I were to press Q, do a difference, we have cut it into the last level, of course, because we didn't hold control and bypass the sort. So if we take a look at this, we can see that this shape is already parented. We can do the same thing again, just to double confirm, Q difference, and we are already off to the races, able to move this object no problem. So sometimes I like to work without parenting involved and then just press Q and use late parent at the end in order to fix parenting. But in most cases, it is something that we can also fix as you're working. So it really depends on your preferences as a user. So a lot of the options that exist, as long as you're looking at the tooltips and are aware of the workflow, you should be able to see how they can help you in your particular workflow style, whether you're the type of person who wants to work completely linearly forward, or if you like to deliberate and ponder each step of the process. So if we press Ctrl tilde, we now look at our two options for C# and Smart Apply for remove cutters. So basically, whenever you perform a Boolean, cutters are added, but C# is capable of removing these cutters. And when we talk about C# here, we're talking about the C# that is actually the control click of sharpen. So that's something that we'll be going into when we begin talking about sharpening. But if we control click sharpen at this point, notice that it will remove all the cutters that are over here on the other side. However, because of the way that C# works, it didn't actually apply things the way that you would expect that they would. In fact, what C# does is it applies booleans, but it doesn't apply bevels. And because these modifiers are relying upon each other, we can't actually work that way. To be honest, this is where smart apply comes in. So we'll actually remove cutters for smart apply, and I'll just introduce you guys to smart apply real quick. Smart apply is built to be the successor of C#. While it sounds like you would definitely want a C# capable of doing what smart apply does, C# has its own uses. Sometimes you definitely want to only apply a boolean. Sometimes you only want to apply everything up to the very last bevel. So if we click smart apply, notice that it applies every modifier, but it also removes the cutters, leaving us with our last bevel. So if we press Q, we can adjust our B width, and we see that our last level is live. But if we tap into edit mode, we're actually applying everything else except the final level. So it's a bit of a balancing act when it comes to angles. If you have a level that's broken and you apply things to it, it will definitely cause you issues on this final level. But continuing on with our tour, the next thing is dice options. Dice is a new option to hardops that allows you to basically dice an object and make it capable of deforming along curves or using twist 360. It has two different algorithms. One is more capable with 2D shapes, and one is definitely a lot better with 3D shapes. Changing the axis is something that we made user controllable. Basically, in its current state, if we bring up dice, whenever I move the mouse, it means that moving the mouse will move it kind of like loop cut would be. The goal was to make this be a loop cut for n-gons. So whenever you're using this, you could also make it where just moving the mouse will add more segments, which is a stranger way to use it, but it also exists. There's also an option to make dice capable of applying, either apply everything or basically run smart apply, which is useful for being able to bevel and have all these live modifiers, but being able to dice it to deform it, but also applying the modifiers needed in order to make the dice go through successfully. So this will be part of dice when we go into it more in depth as we go along this. But continuing on, mesh clean is another one. HardOps has the ability to clean up useless edges. So if we have this cube and we right click and subdivide, we have all this extra geometry. And this extra geometry is good and all, but what if we actually wanted to clean it? We could actually just go in our cube menu and choose clean mesh, and notice that the surface is now completely clean, and we're able to now begin working on this most simplest form, and we can start just kicking it up old school, just taking it where we want to go. And then if we need to clean things up again, we just hit it with a clean mesh, and notice that it gets rid of everything useless. Of course, with all of our options, including clean mesh, you can press F9 to bring up a panel where you can actually set these options up on the fly to get the type of behavior that you want. But for users who are used to hardops, we also are fans of basically configuring our tools in advance. So this panel allows you to configure the behavior of mesh clean prior to its usage. So the next thing is to talk about the operator options. This one is more of a classic option that basically refers to some things inside of hardops that are also preferences, but are things that we felt users might want to interact with on the fly. Bevel profile refers to the bevel profile that's set by default. For reasons, our default bevel is set to 0.7. So that means whenever you add a bevel, you can see at the bottom here where profile is that it's set to 0.7. However, let's right click cancel that. If we set this to 0.5, we can actually just cut in a bevel like normal, which is something you might expect, but we find that it's a little bit more problematic, more skewing towards the shading sometimes. So for reasons stemming from our 2.79 foundations, we've always used 0.7. So C Sharpen is another aspect of hardops that has now been consolidated into the Sharpen workflow that I'll be going more into depth with. So these options aren't as important as they used to be. Cut in is another type of Boolean that is similar to basically a difference, except instead of cutting the shape in and keeping it live with a responsibility to the shape that you defined as the target, this will just cut it and be done. To show it in action, let's just do a Boolean, meaning let's just set up a bevel on this shape. We will Shift D, and by pressing Q, we can go under Booleans, and there's an option called Cut In. And by using Cut In, we can see that now this shape has been cut to fit this shape. And so it was all destructive. It actually used a bevel and everything, reset the calculations to ensure that the shading worked out good. But it ensures that you can cut a main shape into another main shape without issue in comparison to, say, adding a bevel on a cube. Like, let's say we didn't care about this cube. This cube's purpose is to only be a cutter. That means that this shape is now a cutter and is no longer a target shape, has no importance. All it is a subservient shape to that shape, versus this shape still has its independence and capability of being great. So to wrap up this tour, the next thing is opt-ins, which, as I said previously, my favorite options is the Auto T panel, Auto N panel, along with the sequential cube menu, and Look Dev Set Render, which we'll also be going over as we go forth on this video. When it comes to the opt-ins, there are some options that, you know, over time as a tool we have to evolve, and with the more people that are working here, the more things that people want to change over time and seek to improve and one up each other. So for that reason, users now have the ability to use the very first version of Array that we had, the second version that was slightly more experimental but still has a fan base, and the current version of Array, which we finally wrangled back into control of being a very good array. So currently at this time, people are actually using Array v2, which the main difference is that whenever you press Q and you array, you can press H for help, where you can see there's a slight difference in the way that preferences are. You can press V to go to a 3D mode. Whenever you scroll your array, it actually puts the count in between the distances instead of additively. In fact, what users are more than likely used to is if we press V, we can get out of 2D mode. Let's try that again. We go in here and we just roll the wheel, and you can see that we're setting the distance of the first one, and it has nothing to do with my cursor position, and it's just adding the count off the screen instead of between the 2 points. So because of this, Array v2 is our current winner. But by pressing Ctrl tilde, we can go back into our helper here and continue going over our options. So there's also object properties that you can adjust similar to the object properties on the side. In the event that you're working in full screen, these options become a lot more handy. You can also adjust constraints. I'm a very big fan of constraints, so I love going in here and putting constraints on objects and configuring them. However, I must also add that the eyedropper doesn't work with pop-ups at this time due to a glitch inside of Blender. There's also the modifier panel, where if you have modifiers on your object, you can actually list your modifiers via a pop-up, which is one of the biggest and most popular features of HardOps, and is one that we enjoy the most. We've taken this through so many changes over the years, but the one thing that stays the same is the ability to deal with modifiers, but also workflow. Originally, our helper was just workflow, modifiers, and materials. But before we get to materials, let's actually talk about the area here where you can configure vertex groups and assign things, shape keys. This is all similar to this area over here, where if we press Ctrl tilde, we can see that they're the same things. We can also see that the normals area has finally been fixed. You can also get in here and configure how remesh behaves, as well as get under geometry data and remove any sort of custom split normal data if that's stepping in your way. So to wrap up this tour on the helper, we can finally talk about the HOPS helper, where now in this version we can hover over the button for adding a material. We see that the add material button has been hijacked by blank material, which means that if you select an object and you add a material, it'll add a blank material, which I'll be going over later, and this will just give you a randomly generated material, just assistive towards helping you get a decent rendered result without a whole lot of work, while giving you a random color to assist with indexing. The main thing to keep in mind is that if you're following any of my old tutorials and you need to change your blend mode to be alpha blend, you're still able to do that, and that this is also the area where you specify your cutting material if you're using material cut. Material cut was something that was added previously when I was working on this game on Steam a long time ago, but it basically allows you to cut in a selected material into an object via cut. And so this is useful for times where you want to material work and cut at the same time. So just to show it in action, the flashiest way of showing it is to just jump to blank, which will put a blank material for every cut. So if we duplicate this and we do a difference, we can see that this has been given a random material. We could duplicate it again, do a difference. This has also been given a random material. This area also a random material. So blank material cut's just fun and a half to just get in and quickly give sides a unique material index for things like baking and export or whatever your needs may be. But in the event that you're also needing to reuse these colors, you know, I usually pick my favorites, give them names, and then from there just reuse them as, say, accents or main colors or main color B. But with that, we can actually wrap up this tour of the material modifier helper and what it can offer you. Hopefully that provided a little bit of insight.